And as you found out in your research, is sometimes you think like people aren't aware of what is in the Mudawana, when if you actually do the research, you actually find on the ground, but actually something maybe different going on.
Yeah.
In your case, the people were very aware of what the Mudawana was about. So that was a...
And actually, I mean, one of my sort of conclusions that I was able to get out of my research was also, you know, this over focus on civil society and what civil society can do to overcome the lack of infrastructure, the lack of development, and so on. And I do think that looking at, you know, sort of the state or bringing the state back into conversation and research, I think is also, I think would be very beneficial for, you know, to kind of further understand the failures of human development in Morocco.
That's wonderful. Do we have some time to open up to some questions? Because I'm sure, given the number of rather different and quite controversial issues that have been brought up, all the best research brings up controversy, by the way. It's not a good research project if it doesn't open up a whole load of debates. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, perhaps even that you have for Dr. ŽVAN Elliot. Is there anybody who would like to see a hand there?
Thank you very much for your talk. That was amazing. I do have a question.
Could you stand up, please, just so we can hear you?
So throughout your research, I was wondering if you noticed any lack of transparency when it comes to the way that the associations did their work, or you know, the motives that they had versus what actually really was present.
Thank you. Thank you, Miriam. So my current project, so I'm working with a local organization in El Hajab, and so, you know, it's an organization that doesn't have the kind of media exposure or the access to funding, like, for example, UFM and UAF, yeah? And there's huge differences in how they do their work and also the purpose of their work. And also, I think, in terms of how they, sort of the relationship that they're establishing between them and their clients. And I think this is very interesting. One of the things that came up when I was doing an interview at ADFM, and there was my assistant was with me, and she wears a hijab. And the interview was one of the one of the coldest interviews I've ever had, and it was really hard to talk to, particularly one of the women I was interviewing. And at the end, when we left the association, I asked Amina, you know, what did you think of it? And she said, oh, it's because I wear a hijab. And I said, you know, don't be silly. I mean, of course it's not. And she said, no, it's how they sort of, you know, because she basically said, you know, they didn't really know what to do with me because, you know, I speak English and it just doesn't fit with their kind of idea of what a hijabi woman is. And then a couple of months later, I was reading a PhD thesis that was produced by Nadia Gessus, a big name. I mean, her family name is a big name. She's a niece of Nasha Gessus, yeah. And so her PhD thesis, which was written at Columbia University, dealt with ADFM and kind of, yeah, ADFM and kind of the, in a way, genealogy of civil rights movement, women's rights movement within Morocco. And one of the things actually that she writes about is, and that she also sort of was very critical about, is how, you know, is exactly this idea of, you know, if you're an empowered woman in Morocco, you cannot wear a hijab. And she actually mentioned, I think maybe it might have been in a footnote, that they also have this sort of unwritten policy of not employing women who wear a hijab for, you know, even as interns. So I think this was one of these issues where I mean, it's not lack of transparency, but it was just sort of, you know, something that really sort of struck me. Yeah.
Thank you. Stand up so we can hear you.
Hello, thank you so much, Professor, for your amazing talk. During your field work, did you try to convince or tell girls or women that actually marriage was not the end or life goal? Because we all noticed that it is for them the most important thing. Well, actually, it's not.
So yeah, thank you, Marva. You know, as an academic, that's not my role, right? I can't, you know, and also, I mean, you know, part of I guess the, in a way, beauty of fieldwork is also, you know, that because you're sort of, you know, trying to immerse yourself and trying to see why things are the way they are from their perspective. You know, I sort of, you know, saw why girls want to get married, and it made sense. And this kind of goes back to your question of whether, you know, I would tell these girls, you know, no, you should pursue education and so on. And you know, I can't just say yes, because I know of the problems that they will face. And you know, for a lot of these girls, actually, I mean, getting married in that particular setting makes a lot more sense than getting an education. Because getting an education, not only in that area, but actually in a lot of very similar economically depressed areas, you know, doesn't bring autonomy, doesn't bring empowerment, because there's no jobs, or no jobs that would give them, you know, this kind of opportunities. So there's no real sort of alternative, yeah? So, I mean...
You were saying a lot of the women who go for education, particularly university education, they come back to the area where there just aren't the jobs for university educated women yet.
Exactly. I mean, part of it was not because they wanted to necessarily return to this area, but their parents felt that, you know, they sort of risked the family honor to send the girls to, you know, to live on university campuses, and there's a lot of sort of, you know, very negative stereotypes about girls living away from their parents, you know, and why they pursue education, and so on. And their parents, you know, their fathers, and so on, actually were, you know, said, no, I want my daughter to be educated, because they actually bought into this idea of, you know, of sort of education as something that, you know, will help you climb the social ladder. But they said, you know, but after that you have to return home and then sort of resume, you know, what's expected from you. So that I mean, but you know, in a way, you could also understand why parents did that, because, you know, just because they would live in a big town doesn't mean that they would actually be able to find a job that would, you know, not only give the money to pay for rent, and rent is quite expensive, live in a good area, but also actually deal with, again, you know, these very negative stereotypes of girls living alone, right? So, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, because, I mean, yes, you know, looking from my perspective, of course I want, you know, education, because, you know, to me education has been wonderful, but it's very contextual, I think.
Other questions?
Economic opportunity is necessary for the development of gender equality, and do you also think even in the West, where there is economic opportunity, there still is a residual patriarchal system that still limits the advancements of women in the West, and can you kind of relate that to Morocco?
Yeah, I mean, definitely economic empowerment is definitely important for, you know, not only women's empowerment, but all sorts of marginalized groups. But I think economic empowerment on its own, I think, cannot solve the problem. I think that there need to be other systemic issues that also need to be addressed. So, for example, if I look at when in Europe, when women were able to, you know, join the workforce and how they were able to do that, I mean, you really see this sort of stark kind of improvement, I think, after World War II. And the reason why that was also because there were policies put in place that allowed women to join the workforce. So maternity leave, providing childcare. That wasn't just childcare, but it was also quality childcare, so the parents could, I mean, so that women, you know, could work without thinking, you know, who did I leave my child with, and so on. And I think these are very important issues that come with economic empowerment. Economic empowerment, I don't think, is just getting a job. I think it's also all of these other issues.
I didn't quite catch whether or not, what reason you gave for the fact that these women who are going away getting educated were not getting married. And I was wondering, because I know there's a lot of research in the UK, that women from Afro-Caribbean families and from Asian or Indian, Pakistani and Bengali families, women are being educated at a far higher rate than men, and that the problem seems to be that when they're educated, they seem threatening and not very marriageable. I mean, and I didn't really hear you elaborate on that. The second thing I wanted to ask you, what criteria are you using for Islamists? Because I don't think Adil Hassan could really be classified as an Islamist movement.
How would you classify them?
Well, it has a Sufi base.
Mm-hmm.
Imam Yassin was originally from the Buchishi.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm basically using the terminology that's sort of, other groups would use too.
They don't like being called Sufi.
No, they don't.
No.
But if we use Karen Armstead, they're not coming from a rationalist sort of modernist position at all. So I was just wondering what you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So first question, and thank you for that because I didn't actually elaborate on that. So these girls, when they left their communities, they were about 19, 20 years old. When they came back, they were 24, 25 years old. What's interesting is that usually when you find when I looked at the census statistics for this particular area, there was the age at first marriage was at 28, and I was where are all these girls that are getting married at the age of 28 when all I heard about was trying to get your girls married as soon as possible. And that wasn't just the parents, it also needs to be emphasized, it was actually the girls themselves that sometimes put their parents in a really hard situation. There was this one girl that actually threatened the parents that if they don't allow her to marry this guy that the parents really didn't like, she actually divorced him a couple of years later, that she will become a prostitute. I mean, really so it's not always the parents that are at fault or poverty and these sorts of things, but it's also girls wanting to get married, which again kind of makes sense in an environment where sex outside marriage or dating and so on is actually a criminal offense, yeah? So when these girls come back, they're too old. They actually, younger girls themselves said, well, their train has long passed. There was this one faqih with whom I had a really, really interesting, a very long conversation that also got really heated at certain points, and actually was very happy that he didn't throw me out of the house at certain points. But he said, when a girl is 23, 24, she can just start using a walker. So, there is this idea that, there is a cutoff age, and that's actually at 2021 for a lot of these girls. One of my friends also said, well, of course, all of these men want to marry young girls because they're much more impressionable than we, and so on. And it's not only the men, lots of times actually also the families that want these young, impressionable women, especially mothers-in-law. This is actually one of the areas that I think would be very, very interesting to explore that hasn't really been looked at, and that is women-on-women violence. Domestic violence, because a lot of the divorces that happened, not a lot, but a number that I was actually surprised, happened not because there was, domestic violence between the husband and the wife, or because, because the couple didn't get along, but actually because the women said, I just couldn't stand my mother-in-law or my sisters-in-law, mistreated me. They beat me. They gave me all these tasks that I was unable to perform, and I just couldn't stand it. And because they spent most of the time with their, the other women in the house, it was just unbearable, and they sought divorce. And they actually said, I actually quite like my husband, but I don't spend much time with him. I spend more time with his sisters and mothers. Sorry, this is just a segue, kind of a side note. But yeah, so there were different reasons that people had. One of them was definitely, that they want younger girls because they're impressionable, because their honor wasn't, or, exactly. The
expectations of the women also might have been different if they were going to have it.
Yeah, that too. But also the fact that, these girls, because they're from Era Shadia, they went to Meknes, some went to Fez to study. But most of them, this was Meknes, it's 400, 500 kilometers away. So there was no sort of family control or society control that could verify their good behavior. So when they came back, people didn't trust them. People didn't, and because there's sort of these stereotypes of girls living away from their parents on campuses alone. I'm sure some of our students are facing that as well, that, you know, why they want to go and study is not because they want to get an education, but because, you know, they want to fool around with boys, because they're prostitutes, because they want to drink and smoke and so on. So when they come back home, they're not eligible as brides anymore because their honor has been tainted, even though they usually have no proof, yeah? And actually these, I mean, at least from my experience, these girls were actually very, very good girls. So, I mean, good girls. I'll just, yeah.
But not the negative stereotype.
Yeah.
Professor Tripp.
Yeah, well, first I want to start off by congratulating you on the book. I just finished it this morning, and I want to put a plug in for it because it was a page turner, and in fact, it's one of the rare academic books where I got to the end, and I wished it would have continued. So I'm waiting for your sequel. But anyway, having said that, one of the questions one gets a sense from the book, and maybe I don't know if it's your intention, but I get the feeling that at the national level, things have kind of stagnated with the women's organizations. And I'd like to pose a hypothesis and just get your reaction. Just from talking to people and reading about what's happening now, it seems that the momentum has actually shifted, but to the grassroots level. And one gets the sense that, you know, with the communal land movement, the Sulaliyat movement, and actually ADFM has been working with them, and that there's actually that the grassroots are reaching out to the national level NGOs, and that there is these laws have in fact sparked this kind of discussion that you've heard on the trains and buses, and that people are talking about subjects that were used to be more taboo and that are sensitive, and that there is grassroots women are getting better access to at least the work of Stephanie Bordat and Saida Kouzi suggests that they're getting better access to hospitals, to municipal courts. They got better relations in the municipal councils and so on. Is that your sense of that maybe there's been, it's shifted, the momentum has shifted to the grassroots and it's at a different level now, and it's percolating up rather than down?
No, definitely. And I think that these local organizations, I think that they're making great work, sort of organizing kind of community as well, and providing this access that's otherwise would lack to women to get, you know, to court, to deal with the papers that otherwise they would have actually no access to, because, I mean, for example, the area where I'm working now in El Hajib, most of the surrounding area, not El Hajib itself, but surrounding areas is Tamazight speaking. I mean, it's Tamazight speaking. Women mostly are monolingual. When they come to deal with at the Muqata or any sort of, you know, with the procureur and so on, they all speak Arabic. Lots of times even Fusha. And so just the language barrier prevents them from accessing, you know, information, for example, or dealing with papers. And so I think that, you know, organizations like, for example, Amal in El Hajib is hugely important, and they're doing great work. Unfortunately, they're also they're underfunded. You know, they don't have enough staff, and, you know, there's other sort of issues as well. But I mean, no, it's definitely true. And I think what's very interesting about, you know, this network of organizations, like, for example, in Amal and the Mobilizing for Rights Association, the Young Advocates in Khumset, and some of the other local organizations that are in this network, is this innovative way of using constitution and rights guaranteed by the constitution to push for further reform, which I think is I mean, great, especially because, you know, in the 1990s, a lot of times when, for example, ADFM or UAF or LDDF and so on, were pushing for reforms, they were accused of being foreign agents, they were accused of being atheists, and these sorts of things. Whereas what they're doing now, what these organizations are doing now, is that they're working with Moroccan documents, with Moroccan law. They were within Moroccan law, and and I think that this is a great sort of innovation, I guess. I think that it will take some time, especially because they haven't been very successful in lobbying the parliament. But at least sort of on the local level, and how they're reaching the population and how they're talking about rights, even, you know, sort of fundamental rights like the right to life, and so on. I think it's very important.
The question there.
I'm wondering if at some point of time you felt that they were restrained or pressured by their husband or their surrounding to not fully disclose the information that you were asking them, and which will eventually question the accuracy of the research.
Thank you for your question. Actually, I mean, I did interviews with both men and women. I didn't just focus on women. I also wanted to obviously hear from the men, yeah? Of course, I mean, you know, interviews, people will tell you, you know, sometimes people will tell you what they think you want to hear, yeah? Or, you know, even though you explain to them your project, you know, they will have a different idea or sort of a different interpretation, and they will give you, you know, the kinds of answers, again, that, you know, they think what you want to hear, or, you know, some will just outright lie, and so on. So obviously you can't take this type of research at face value. And you know, there's a sort of a different way of evaluating this research, and because, you know, lots of times you sort of see patterns, yeah, in these, you know, in the things that they tell you, and then it's not just one type of research that you have to do. Like, for example, you're not just doing interviews, you're actually also doing this in-depth kind of participant observation as well. You can also go and check information. You can ask other people about this information. So there's various different types. I mean, in research methods, that's called triangulation, where you're actually looking, you're doing different types of methods in order to get, you know, I don't want to say accurate picture of what's happening, but more accurate sort of picture of what's happening, yeah? And of course, I mean, you know, it's social sciences, so, you know, we can't speak of facts, yeah? So that's why, you know, you can challenge, you can come up with the different conclusions and so on, yeah? And that's, you know, that's perfectly fine, even actually desired in a way, yeah? Because that just furthers our understanding about a particular issue. But, you know, as a researcher, you're aware of these, of validity issues, and you deal with them in the ways that, you know, that you have to do.
And also, I think one of the things that helped you was spending, I think it was a total of about 15 months in the community, was that the longer you spend, the more versions you hear, the more perspectives, and it gives you a better idea about what actually the reality is, rather than going in just for a few days, and you have to take at face value everything you said. You then, I'm sure, you had comments early on, but as you talked to more people and observed more, you realised weren't quite accurate in what they said, yeah.
Of course.
Which helps a lot, and spending that long time in the field, I think, is very important in helping on that.
Yeah.
Dr. I think we've.
So thank you very much.
I'll add my voice to Dr. Gray's and say it's wonderful actually to see the room this full. It's fantastic, and I think it's an indication of the quality of the scholarship. And I think you will probably all agree with me that this is actually a very effective way of doing the meeting instead of having a lecture. Having the conversation, for me, has been very, very interesting to hear. So I would like to thank Dr. ŽVAN, Elliot, and Dr. Willis for being with us, and also Dr. Gray for I think for